The New York Times ran a front-page story this week. The headline, "In UFO Files, Some Christians See Vexing Questions and Demons." The article describes a meeting that happened in February, a Nashville Airbnb, roughly a dozen pastors and podcasters, phones on airplane mode, two anonymous intelligence operators presenting what they said was coming and warning the church to prepare its people not to be deceived. Two of the people named in that New York Times article are voices the Nori media group community already knows. Alan Didio, who has appeared in the NMG library, was in that room. Tony Merkel of the Confessionals, who has also been featured in NMG content, organized the meeting. Nori Media Group covered this story before the New York Times did. And today I want to do two things: tell you what the Times got right, tell you what it missed, and make the case that the church, the charismatic, prophetically minded, spiritually awake community that most mainstream journalists still treat as fringe, is the only institution in America that actually has a framework sufficient to understand what is unfolding. The fence is disappearing, and the question is whether the church is ready to speak with authority when it does. The Times article lays out the scene precisely. Roughly a dozen pastors and podcasters gathered in Nashville in February. They were already in town for the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, where Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth delivered the keynote. Someone asked them to turn their phones to airplane mode. Snacks were served. Then two men, who declined to give their names or exact professional backgrounds but described themselves as intelligence operators unaffiliated with the U.S. government, presented a slideshow for at least 2 hours. The content, the evidence, as they saw it, for extraterrestrial or interdimensional life, and the spiritual confusion that coming government revelations could sow among Christians. Alan Didio described it to the Times reporter with characteristic directness. "It was the weirdest meeting I've ever been a part of. You've never seen that many Pentecostals in a room that quiet." Tony Merkel, who organized the meeting, told the Times the purpose was clear. "This is what is coming. It seems like the government is gearing up for a disclosure, and you need to be able to prepare and warn your people not to be deceived." Ben Hughes, a Texas pastor who attended, named what he saw as the core spiritual stakes. The fence will disappear. This is going to force people to decide either God is real and Christianity is real and the supernatural is real, or this alien thing is real. As the pastors left the Airbnb and turned their phones back on, news alerts confirmed the timing was not coincidental. That same day, President Trump had directed his administration to begin releasing files related to extraterrestrial life. The room full of Pentecostals, who had just been briefed by anonymous intelligence operators, turned their phones on and watched the government confirm, in real time, that what they had just heard was not speculation. The disclosure had begun. The Times article, written by religion reporter Ruth Graham, is more accurate than most mainstream coverage of this topic. A few things she got right. The framing of the theological challenge is real. Graham correctly identifies why UAP disclosure creates genuine theological difficulty for many Christians. If intelligent non-human beings exist, what does that mean for the biblical account of humanity as the centerpiece of God's plan? What does the incarnation mean if there are other inhabited worlds? These are legitimate questions, and Graham quotes scholars who take them seriously. She is right that the church has not prepared most of its people for them. The statistics are striking. She cites a 2021 Pew Research Center survey. Among atheists and agnostics, 85% believe their best guess is that intelligent life exists outside Earth. Among white evangelicals, only 40% say the same. That gap, 85 to 40, represents a significant divergence in how Christians and the broader culture are reading the same evidence. The church is not well positioned to engage a conversation it has largely refused to have. The political dimension is now undeniable. Graham quotes Vice President J.D. Vance, who said on a conservative podcast this spring, "I don't think they're aliens, I think they're demons." She quotes Representative Lauren Boebert making a similar statement. Whether one agrees with those conclusions or not, the Vice President of the United States has now said publicly what the Pentecostal community in that Nashville Airbnb has believed for years. That is not fringe anymore. That is a political and theological position being stated at the highest levels of the U.S. government. Ruth Graham reported the facts of this story accurately. The meeting happened. The people said what they said. The disclosure is proceeding. Give credit where it is due. But here is what the article misses, and it is the most important thing. The framing of the piece positions the Christians in that room as people responding with fear and confusion to a challenge from the outside world. Defensive, scrambling, trying to fit a new and unsettling reality into an old theological box. That is not what was happening in that room, and it is not what has been happening in the community the Times is writing about. The charismatic and prophetically minded Christian community, the World Alan D. Dio, Tony Merkel, and the NMG library inhabit, has been studying this territory for years, not from a defensive posture, from the posture of a community that already has a robust supernatural worldview. The biblical framework of principalities and powers, the divine council, the Nephilim, and the Book of Enoch, the categories of demonic deception operating through signs and wonders, these are not novel concepts invented to explain a new phenomenon. They are ancient theological architecture that the charismatic community has never abandoned, and that is now suddenly relevant to a conversation the entire culture is being forced to have. The Rice University religion professor quoted in the article, Jeffrey Kripal, actually gets close to this when he says, "The gods have always come from the sky, and we call that religion. We don't have a lot of words in the Western canon for these entities of the middle realm, so my own feeling is that when religious people look out and they see entities that don't fit into their religious world, they call them demons." What he does not acknowledge, because he is looking from the outside in, is that the community he is describing has a very precise and developed vocabulary for those entities. It is not a category error born from theological limitation. It is a theological conclusion drawn from centuries of scripture, church history, and documented encounter with the spiritual realm. The church is not behind on this conversation. It is the only institution that has been having it seriously for 2,000 years. What the New York Times frames as a community struggling to cope is actually a community that has been preparing, and the disclosure moment the government is now producing is not a challenge to that framework. It is a confirmation of it. Ben Hughes named the moment precisely. The fence is disappearing. The disclosure is creating a forced binary, and the church must be ready to speak into it with clarity, humility, and genuine authority. A few things the NMG community should be equipped to say. The existence of non-human intelligences is not a surprise to anyone who takes Scripture seriously. The Bible describes a populated spiritual universe: angels, fallen angels, principalities, powers, the divine council, the Nephilim. The idea that humanity is the only sentient being in creation is not a biblical position. It is a modern Western assumption that the Scripture does not require. The question is not whether non-human intelligences exist. The question is what their nature and allegiance are. The biblical test for spiritual entities is not origin, it is fruit. Whatever these phenomena are, the biblical framework for evaluating them is clear. By their fruits you will know them. An intelligence that undermines the authority of Scripture, denies the incarnation, or positions itself as a higher source of revelation than the God of Israel is, by definition, not a benign visitor. It does not matter whether it arrived in a craft or from another dimension. The test is theological, not astronomical. This is not a moment for fear. It is a moment for clarity. Russell Moore, quoted in the Times, said something worth holding on to. If we assume the possibility that there's something outside of Earth, our basic default should be the way we treat strangers generally. The Church's response to the disclosure moment should not be panic or defensive circling of the wagons. It should be the calm, grounded authority of people who have read the last chapter of the book and know how it ends. The NMG community has been in this conversation. The library this channel has built, the UAP disclosure content, the spiritual warfare content, the prophetic content, is exactly the resource the broader church needs right now. Share it. Follow Nori Media Group for more. If this is a conversation your church, your small group, or your family is trying to navigate, the NMG library has the content. Links to our UAP disclosure series and spiritual warfare resources are in the description. Drop a comment. What is the question you are being asked most by people in your life about UAP disclosure? What are they confused about? What do they want to know? I read everyone, and your comments shape what we cover next. And if the New York Times wants to come back and cover this story in 6 months, the NMG community will still be here. We will still be saying the same thing we have been saying. The fence is disappearing. Make sure your people know what side they are standing on.